We're now going to hear from one of Australia's leaders in the field. And the topic is that the pandemic has emphasised the interconnectedness of our economies, ecologies and societies, and of people, purpose and planet. But what does this shift mean for modern leaders globally? So sit back and enjoy the views of Dr. Amanda Rischbieth. Amanda is a visiting scientist at Harvard Chan School of Public Health, a position she has held for 4 years. She's currently advising boards and CEOs on environment, social and governance issues, so all the ESG issues. She was competitively selected for a Harvard Advanced Leadership Fellowship in 2017, one of 40 international fellows and the only Australian. Amanda is also an advisory council member for the Harvard Business School-led Impact-Weighted Accounts Initiative. She has over 35 years in business, academia and health, including as CEO for 6 years. And she's also had 21 years of non-executive experience in director roles. Amanda chairs the National Blood Authority, is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and a clinical associate professor at the University of Adelaide. She's a member of the International Women's Forum Australia, a Governor's Leadership Foundation Fellow and a former Telstra Business Awards finalist, unsurprisingly. Earlier in her career, Amanda led an intensive care unit for 10 years and chaired a National College of Critical Care. In 2018, she went to Sri Lanka on a humanitarian project team fitting prosthetic hands to over 240 landmine victims. Ladies and gentlemen, my dear friend, Amanda Rischbieth.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for that warm and kind introduction, Maria. Can I start by paying my respects to the Kaurna people and the traditional owners, emerging past, present, and those that are joining us today virtually or in the room. How fortunate I am to be on Kaurna country. So Maria's given me a big topic, and nicely done after all those amazing speakers this morning, Maria. So I hope to do some justice to that. So this was drawn by Emara 7. And if you look at that graphic, it's very telling, isn't it? I'll talk about Emara later. So what are the origins of leaders? We're going to talk about leadership, come back to leadership, and then a whole bunch of things in between. We're all clear on this. We've all seen this picture. We've seen this statement that I suspect will become immortalised. We are all here. And I think Adam Grant, in his Twitter account from Wharton, spoke of the summary of what constitutes a leader beautifully, and this is only last week. Charisma attracts attention. Courage earns admiration, but commitment is a commitment to a group inspires loyalty. But we all stand on the shoulders of giants, don't we, in terms of leaders past in our histories. And Eddie Mabo, obviously an Australian leader in the space of a long decade or so of fighting for land rights for Aboriginal people, with the succession in 1993 of the Natal Title Act. And of course, we have a long way to go. And then there's other very sort of quiet leaders. So behind the scenes, Australian. So this is Eddie Holmes, and he was the first person to sequence the human genome in terms of the coronavirus. And what he did was he did that, and then he pressed the send button and sent that around the world. And that set off enormous amounts of collaboration that we're well aware of in terms of work being done at pace, at speed, around the world. And then, of course, you had this fine group here, and you'll recognise Sharon Lewin and others from the Doherty Institute, who, when there was a case of COVID in Australia, one of the cases of COVID, managed to isolate the actual COVID isolate from that person, and again shared that around the globe. So those two particular collaborative efforts shows true global leadership, because it set off that train, as we know now, looking back, of what happened in terms of the development of vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. Just recently, only a couple of days ago, we've had more great research done by amazing leaders around trying to understand why is it that some people get very affected by COVID and others not so. What's the genetic underpinning of that? And this group identified about 16 specific genes related to that, and published in Nature, of course, high impact journal there. So we'll hear more about that over time. And then, of course, we've got our front and centre leaders. Intensive care was my world for many, many years. People used to say, well, what do you do in intensive care? And of course, now the world understands what intensive care is. And it was my privilege to work in that space a long time ago. St Mary's Hospital. I worked there in 1985 in the intensive care unit on level 4. I was leading the hospital in the middle of the night, 11 o'clock at night, got the pager. Can you handle anything that happens outside the ICU that might happen overnight? You're in charge. So that was a fire. That was a fire that spread through the basement, resulting in evacuating the entire hospital. I was 26. So leadership is often things that are thrust on you in crisis, thrust on you that you don't have a plan, and you work through. Fortunately, I can tell you there was no one harmed or hurt by that. In the intensive care world, in my leadership roles, I did some work back in 2007 as part of my PhD, trying to understand how do you identify skills and match them to the acuity, how sick the patients are in ICU. So I looked at every intensive care unit in Australia. And what I found was there was really disparate systems, and came up with a tool that was able to reduce adverse events by up to 80%. And I'm really excited to be hearing from Siobhan Savage later this afternoon around her business rejig, which is using ethical AI to really understand skills and match them. So 15 years after my PhD work. More recently, I've been so privileged to work with two amazing leaders, Professor George Serafheim, Professor Howard Koh from Harvard Chan and the business school at Harvard. And this was a paper we published in 2020. So it was after COVID, but we'd written the paper before COVID. And the premise was, how do you have health people talk to business people about sustainability and bring all these things together? So we published the paper, but then of course the pandemic hit. And now the world has got the memo around the impact of health, business, sustainability. I'll talk a bit more about that. And impact-weighted accounts is about how do you monetize impact, a conversation for another day. So we know there's economic winners and losers out of COVID. We could do lots of slides on all of this. This is just around one slide on GDP change across countries from 2021. Obviously debt, we know that there's huge debt around the world that's happened during COVID, and many slides we could talk to about that. This is just one of Spain again in 2021, but it's going to be the payback for the next generation, isn't it, about all of the spending and the debt that's been incurred during COVID. This was interesting. I was part of a panel discussion with General Motors and some other people with an IBM webinar back at the end of 2020. And the executive from General Motors put up this slide. So this is August 2020, back to work. And do you remember what happened after that? We had Delta. So what happens is these things get thrown up, even though we know that we think we've got a plan and then we have to go to plan B. So to sort of summarise some of the lessons from the pandemic, I've taken these ones from the Hugh Director General and also from Dean Michelle Williams. Science must guide policy, but it can widen inequalities, and we've seen that occur, haven't we? Unless there's a paired commitment to really address that inequality. Risk of COVID are borne unequally through the population, and we've seen that bigger divide across during COVID. Countries need more resilient health systems. We need to have a better agreement that sets the rules for the game, responding to pandemics, endemics going forward, and of course trust is everything. And I've added 3 more. I really believe that health is a strategy, not a program. Human rights really matter, and we'll talk to that a bit. And of course, people, planet, purpose all matter. what lies ahead in terms of the pandemic, likely future waves. The virus is going to continue to evolve in those developing countries, particularly where they've got low vaccination rates. We've got to understand what burden of disease are we prepared to accept as a community. And then what about the workplace workers, talent, and the future? And we're discussing a lot of that today. And what about the litigation that's quite likely to unfold? So this cover of the Lancet journal was from 2009. So 2009, the headline, climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And we're now in 2022. So fast forward, we've got the memo. The science is pretty clear, but it's complex. So we've got regulation, we've got the SDGs around the Sustainable Development Goals. We've got ESG, environmental social governance. We've got other standards around the country, the TCFD, the TNFD. I could put up 3 more slides with all the complexities of this. So business owners and business leaders and government leaders have to grapple with the balance of how do we produce growth, make profit, look after our people, and look after the planet. Just a bit about the global greenhouse gases. This is just a slide that shows, essentially, if you look at the far right, the big grey zone, that's the large area and high cost of difficult to abate emissions. So there's a long way to go in how we're going to abate these emissions over time. Yes, there might be some offsets, but it's going to be really complicated, and we have to do this at pace. Detailed slide, but the point of this slide is just about saying that climate risks are different across industry, across business. That adds to the complexity. So how does business try and understand what are the physical risks, what are the transition risks that we have across this journey? If we look at Australia, we haven't got such a great record at the moment. It's great to see there's some commitment by the federal government and state governments around this. We're getting all on the same page, but there's a lot of work to do. And this is just a look at decarbonisation ratings around the globe. A lot of work ahead of us. But apart from climate change, which is the environment part of this schematic by SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, so they bring together sort of this universe, if you like. I like this slide because it splits out all of the different things that we need to tackle, which is why it's so complex for owners to understand. So we've got the environment, we've got leadership and governance, we've got the business model and innovation side we talked a lot about today, social capital, human capital. How do we think about all of these things in our business? And then more recently, this really big drive around the social side. How does business conduct itself to achieve social transformation? This isn't a nice to have. This isn't a bit of CSR from old days. This is about if you want to look after your people and have them come and work for you, you have to understand how this sits and fits. And this is a nice study done by the World Benchmarking Alliance. Act ethically, provide and promote decent work, and respect human rights, a theme that we'll hear a lot more about coming forward. Some great work out of Harvard Chan by the Shine Group. So they have done some fantastic research around work as a platform for wellbeing. So purpose, social connection, positive mood, satisfaction, self-efficacy and autonomy, challenge, mastery, progress, health, financial literacy, all really important as part of your work. A whole bunch of global people working with them. And where they sort of landed with a lot of this is a caring culture. And I'd just like to say it's not soft. So I'm not so keen on the soft skills. I think these are really imperative skills for all business. I wouldn't describe them as soft. I would describe them as imperative. So they talk about this. They talk about this in terms of care, trust, fairness, respect, and support. And then they also talk about the relationship with flourishing. So what are the 6 domains of flourishing? So after a whole bucket of work, many years, they've landed on these 6 domains: happiness, life satisfaction, mental and physical health, character and virtue is really important, social relationships, and financial and material stability. And over COVID, some of those things dipped, and there's been a lot of research around this. But these things are really important in the new way. It's no longer the staff engagement survey. It's trying to think about your workers differently and what you bring. So this balance of caring culture and then individual flourishing, and how do we, as leaders, bring both to our game in our workplaces, whether that's government, private enterprise, entrepreneurship, in all of those places. This is some work done by Jason Boer, who's a former Navy SEAL of over 20 years as a US Navy SEAL. And I came across and met Jason when I was living in Boston for quite a while, and I really liked the way he sort of summarised some of this in terms of share a common purpose, leverage a common process, ensure the right capability, invest in development. And this is all that bit about the execution. So strategy is one part, as we know as leaders, but what about the execution, getting that right? Otherwise the strategy fails. And his quote, "Our people are no longer satisfied with grand ESG plans that aren't executed. They want real meaningful investment. The time for action is now." So challenges and opportunities for modern leaders. I've tried to sort of snapshot some of these. Complexity and uncertainty. We're in just-in-time models broken. We heard about that this morning. Supply and demand shocks. What about reassuring that sovereign capability? Geopolitical risk, disruption, inflation coming. More and more mental anguish for those left behind. Hybrid work distractions and that balance of acquiescence. How much do we acquiesce versus what's right for the role and the place? The pace of decarbonisation we're going to need going forward, never previously seen before. And then of all the digital and disruptive workforce challenges about place, what are the levers of productivity, retention and career development for our people? And visible leaders, just as I showed you in the first slide, out front. That doesn't mean above. So is it time for a new memo? So the caring culture is 5.7 times more strongly associated with workers' performance than workload. And a quote from, again, from WHO, from Tedros Ghebreyesus, COVID-19 is a powerful demonstration that a pandemic is so much more than a health crisis. It illustrates the connectedness between health and the economy, security, education and intimate links between the health of the humans, animals and the planet. And I come back to that piece that I had in one of my earlier slides, if I can leave it with you. Health is a strategy, it's not a program. It affects everything. So back to Imara 7. What do you think she was doing on the weekend? This was what she did on the weekend. She made a placard. She was in London with her family and she marched. Stop the war in Ukraine, please. No more wars in the world, please, and no more fighting. Imara 7. So when we look at future leaders, I think Imara is going to be one of those people that we'll see in generations to come. And then finally, come to South Australia. Bring your businesses here. Bring your work, your family, your entrepreneurship. South Australia, and I'm a proud South Australian, you can tell. Come here, and we've talked about that this morning. It's an entrepreneur's destination, but not only entrepreneurs. It's all those with skills, community interests, the arts and culture, every part of society. Come to South Australia. This is where it's at. And this is some pictures of my son Will, who's an entrepreneur, who was racing World Cups in mountain biking, did a diesel mechanic apprenticeship, and then brought those worlds together around e-bikes, tourism, health, and a whole bunch of other things. So come to South Australia. So thanks, Maria. A bit fast and furious. I'm an identical twin, so I talk fast. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. We've got a lot of content there for us to absorb and take back to our workplaces.